This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and with Formula One taking a brief hiatus, what better time to scrutinise some of the rules we would change to make things better? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to table their proposals for rules that should be ditched and how this can be achieved are Ben Anderson and Samarth Kanal. Samarth, we'll come to you first. We haven't had you on for a bit since Baku. Actually, not that long, but what have you been up to? What's new? Dazzle us.
Well, I caught COVID. It was COVID. That's what's new. But I'm fine now.
That's quite retro.
It's quite retro. It's
Did you
making a comeback
back
though.
to 2020?
Yeah, it's in now. It's the in thing to get COVID. So actually, it's pretty cool.
You're on trend. I see.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what's new with me. But yeah, wear your masks.
Good sound advice. Ben, have you got something more uplifting that's new?
Fortunately, haven't had COVID, at least not to my knowledge. Every time I've tried to test for COVID, it's always been negative. So I'm one of the lucky ones, I guess. So get well soon, Samarth. I have, just been rather like you, Ed, just buried in the relentless Daniel Ricciardo soap opera of Red Bull driver shenanigans. So, yeah, coming out the other side of that and now hoping for a bit more of a respite as the F1 enjoys its odd super long autumn break, which we've never had before, I don't think.
Yeah, but that's the thing, isn't it? With storylines like Red Bull's driver thing, like the actual Ricciardo decision, it was a while ago, but just the fallout continues to rumble, doesn't it? It's just one of those things that keeps going. But that probably tells you A, how popular Daniel Ricciardo is, and B, how much of it is a soap opera, the whole Red Bull driver thing is. But we're not going to talk about that today. I don't think we're going to be proposing rules that insist Red Bull just sort their drivers out. I think we'll be stuck with that changing. But what we are going to do today is talk about rules we ditch and how we would achieve that. This has been partly inspired by my impassioned attacks on fastest laps after the Singapore Grand Prix. So that kind of becomes the default opening for this. But yeah, we just want to look at a few regs that could be tweaked a little bit or removed or reversed completely in order to make things better and create a little bit of debate. So, yeah.
Bonfire of the rules.
Exactly, yeah. The first one I'm going to throw onto the bonfire is indeed fastest lap. I won't go over it in too much depth because I've addressed it a fair bit. But my arguments are basically that it's too circumstantial and only available to those who happen to have a gap to take a fresh set of tyres and do an all-in lap. And even when it happens, like Ricciardo's lap in Singapore, it was 3.4 seconds off his qualifying time. So it was hardly a qualifying lap in terms of execution. Ultimately, the way the tyres work currently in Formula One and have for some time means that fastest lap is just so situational to you actually having the rubber on the car. Sometimes it's set by those on harder tyres, which is a bit more legitimate, or on more aged tyres rather, but too often it's not. And it was often a reward for failure as well. Plenty of times when a driver who's at the back of the lead group has that gap to pit into. I think points should be a measure of achievement and fully earned. The fastest lap point isn't. And the very fact it's limited to those who finish in the top 10 shows that was fully understood when the rule came in 2019. And people say it's to create a talking point. Well, it was in Singapore, but how often is it? How many celebrated fastest lap storylines are there from the past 5-6 years? Not very many. So that's my quick summary of the case. So it's down to you two to tear it apart and prove me wrong.
Well, you have a particular bone of contention with fastest laps anyway, Ed, because I remember you once describing the fastest lap as the last respite of the fool, I think, in terms of summing up your race weekend and considering it to be an achievement.
Exactly. I used to, just like you, I used to race, and there'd always be somebody who would look at their fastest lap and say, oh, my fastest lap was quicker than yours. And it's like, yeah, this isn't qualifying. This is a string of laps put together. That's what a race is. Yeah, fastest lap. I mean, it's interesting, and there are certain circumstances where it's a bit more meaningful, but I just don't like it on race day. Give a point for pole position if you must, but not for fastest lap.
The bit of your argument, I mean, you made this in a video we did on the Ricciardo fastest lap, gimme for Verstappen's championship bid. And you said, well, Norris had the fastest lap. It was taken away from him by a legitimately quicker lap. But the circumstances of him doing what was his fastest lap were more challenging because he's leading the race, trying to gap the cars behind, doing it on heavier fuel, more worn tyres, etc. So it's a slower lap, but more of an achievement. So I'm with you there, because you get these what the problem is, these artificial fastest laps that have been done deliberately, not just by Ricciardo at the end of the Singapore Grand Prix, in many other occasions, just less notable because there wasn't the kind of political.
Joe has got 2 fastest laps in F1.
There has to be something for him to cheer from his time in F1, right? So we won't knock him for that. But normally they go, without a nod, because there's no emotional, is it his last race or not context, no political background to it. But in terms of what you'd obliterate, would you get rid of it entirely, or would you just stop it from being a top 10 only thing and say, right, whoever gets fastest lap, they get a point for it?
No, I would make it no point for fastest lap, because it's a string of laps in a race. It's a footnote. I mean, you can record it. It has been for a long time. I'm fine with that. But if you don't limit it to the top 10, then you'll create a madness down the field with like mini qualifying sessions going on.
Let's have a fastest lap championship. Why not?
Well, in that case, and if that matters, then points in qualifying is a better argument. I'm not a big fan of points in qualifying, but if you really want to say, oh, whoever's the fastest over a single lap matters, why not award it for the session where the point is to set the fastest individual lap time? You could even tweak it a little bit and say it's the fastest lap set of the whole weekend.
Across the whole thing.
So, for example, in Bahrain, Leclerc didn't get pole, but he did set the fastest time of the weekend in Q2. But yeah, that I'm not. I'd be less irritated with that existing, but I just think take it away. Samarth, are you going to launch an impassioned defence of the fastest lap?
No, I don't think it's added a single thing to Formula One. It's just, and my issue is that it rewards the people in no man's land. That's what it does. So you've got a free pit stop, and you're like, it's so predictable. Like, just come in and swap tires. I mean, it's just dull, isn't it? I mean, it's added absolutely nothing. And I don't think it's going to come down to the wire because of a fastest lap. And if it does, that would annoy me, I think, because it just seems like a reward for people who are kind of slow, but not. Unless you're right at the front and you've eked out a massive advantage, I guess.
Yeah, which can happen.
But then you're just rewarding them for being even faster.
Yeah, exactly. And it should be it shouldn't be so circumstantial. So I think we can safely say the fastest lap rule. I have won. I've won the podcast, so we've got that out of the way.
It's unanimous, I think. Is this like Room 101 where we, open a fake trapdoor and it drops in?
We need a sound effects.
We're consigning it to the bonfire, so have you got some flame effects that producer Johnny can add?
Well, let's give it a go. We haven't discussed this. We're recording it now and it's going to be edited. So fastest lap, we're ditching that rule. Insert sound effects here. Now, I've got no idea how that sounded, but if it sounded cool, great. If you hear this and there's nothing there, it should have been edited out because we've not done a sound effect. But if there is a sound effect, well done. Johnny, right.
Where's Valtteri Bottas when you need him?
Exactly. About 18th currently, given the pace of the Sauber, generally. So we're going to basically pick 3 things each. So I've done my first one. So Ben, you are next up. What's your first choice?
That's a good question. I can't remember. I'm gonna have to look at your outline.
You feel so impassionate about it. We produced this list of who's doing what in what order, and you just don't refer to it.
It's one of my favourite bugbears. Track limits. Track limits should go in the bin. I really hate this arbitrary, minuscule, tiny bit of tyre over the white line, all full wheels, lap deleted or penalty applied, race weekend ruined, all or nothing thing. And especially now that they're reinstalling gravel on the outside of corners of the Red Bull Ring, there was this whole sustained argument that we couldn't have proper natural hard track limits anymore. We had to have super smooth circuits and runoff areas for miles and flat curves because of bike racing. But MotoGP went to
which I should say, bikes always get blamed, and then people involved in bikes will say, no, actually, it's nothing to do with that. So it's a really weird. So there are times when I accept you need certain standards, but yeah, it's the catch-all dismissive argument that doesn't actually stand up always.
Yeah, for years, this has been used as the baseline justification for having this microscopic approach to track limits, and they've reverted to this gravel solution in Austria, which I think was a good step, but we still had the ridiculous Oscar Piastri, was he over the line or not, helicopter view controversy. And then the bikes go to the Red Bull Ring around a month later. There's no noise about, there's not scores of professional bike racers with gravel rash, a huge clamour from the MotoGP paddock to go back to the version of the Red Bull Ring that didn't have those gravel strips. So if we can do that there, and that track is the hotbed of all track limit controversies in motorsport and in F1 in particular, we can do it anywhere else, and there aren't that many really circuits where there are track limit problems, and we can just stop talking about it, stop policing it, just have the natural limit, and if you go off and you get away with it, good for you, but more often than not, it's going to slow you down, and then we won't have to have stewards kind of micro-analysing the tiniest bit of driving, which is impossible to judge, as Max Verstappen has explained, from behind the wheel.
Yeah, exactly. And just to be clear, it is having a natural track limit. It's not creating a situation that we have often in the Porsche Supercup where they can reinvent the lap however they want, which is really weird and seems to happen in Porsche Supercup. It's very, very irritating. Or a situation like we had at IndyCar at COTA a few years ago, remember the penultimate corner, and they were basically inventing a new turn that was just much wider. So we don't really want that happening. But
I don't mind.
Natural,
I'd be happy for that. I think there's a certain art form in driving a circuit, whichever line you feel is the fastest. There is still always a shortest way round.
Yeah, but how do you tell the difference between doing that and you're approaching turn 1 at COTA and do a U-turn and drive back? I've done a lap.
Well, it's obvious.
That's an absurd version of it, but you've got to have some defined track, and you can't use the runoff as part of the track because of safety reasons, because that's designed to create certain kind of decelerations in terms of hitting barriers, etc.
I wouldn't eliminate the white lines. I'd like to, but I won't, because you have to define the track.
Yeah, they can be there.
But I suppose what I'm arguing for is you don't need to police the track to the nth degree. You should be able to construct the circuit in a way that it self-polices, and you leave it up to the drivers to do it properly, and then you use your common sense to judge absolutely ludicrous corner cutting or dangerous situations like doing a U-turn at the first corner of the Circuit of the Americas.
Now, I can see Samarth is concocting a counter argument. Are you gonna be in the corner of let's just have a big asphalt area that you just randomly paint lines on and everyone drives around how they want?
Well, the issue is that if you stick gravel at the end of every corner, then a car's going to go off, spin, and then take out all the other cars, is what I anticipate will happen. So it's quite dangerous to have gravel at the end of every corner. So surely you need something black and white to be like, right, you're off the track, you're on the track. Now, I kind of sympathise with the rule makers on this, because what are you supposed to do? I mean, you kind of need a line there. If you cross it, you're done. I think that works, right? It's like the offside rule.
No, circumstances play into it. That's the problem.
Ben, are you just angry about that track limits violation you got at the Red Bull Ring in the McGann Trophy?
I'm angry about all of them. I've had one there, I've had one at Spa, but I'm not the only one. You know, all the drivers find the track limits policing endlessly frustrating because it's done from a point of view where you can't understand as a steward or an observer the context of what the driver is doing. So when you're judging these absolutely microscopic breaches, often you can get done on an absolute level, even though you've lost time or gone slower compared to what you've done before. And it's that is what I take issue with. It's like everything, it's become over-regulated for this kind of broad aim of consistency in all decisions. And I just think that's wrong. As a sort of general principle, you need more of a common sense approach that takes a more sympathetic view to what's actually happened in front of you, rather than saying everything's absolutely black or white.
I mean, it was the Red Bull Ring this year where Norris went off, and then there was, if he hadn't crashed, well, if him and Verstappen hadn't crashed, there would have been an inquest into had he gone off and then got the final track limits penalty, even though he'd lost time by going off. I mean, I agree, that is just a nonsensical situation.
Yeah, stupid.
And then what you have back at teams is them watching everyone else's lap during qualifying to see if they can tell on them and have the FIA go down on them and go, oh, right, well, you've actually gone off track in Q3, so it should be deleted. I mean, it has created a sort of like, let's snitch on each other situation and this whole kind of like telling on everyone else, which I just hate. It's just so puerile. So I'll agree with you on that.
And in fairness as well, drivers will always take liberties if they can. So if there is an advantage to be gained, they'll nick it. So they're not blameless in this in that regard. But that's why I like what Ben was talking about having natural track limits, ones that you can feel. You know, the classic example is you're doing a qualifying lap and you just touch the grass and can you hang on? You're pushing it right to the limit. You've actually, just by touching the grass, you will have lost out a tiny bit, but you're just on that ragged edge and you've got away with it. Or you run the risk of just the car going around and you being in the barrier. So
Piastri for me was on the ragged edge, and he should have been able to keep that lap, because it's like, oh, you've just gone in, but you've got away with it. But instead, it's like, oh no, default to the steward's room and let's get the cameras out and zoom in. It's exactly the same phenomenon to me as VAR in football, well intended, but creating unintended consequences that actually diminish the whole process of enforcing the rules of a sport.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And I think maybe there's also a chance to investigate further technology in terms of what you can do to have track limits that are feelable for drivers, rather than just being a white line as well. So that makes it easier for them to detect as well. There's a lot to be said for that, but it's just constantly dissatisfying. And yeah, I think the current track limits situation, needs to be got rid of. So are we opening the trapdoor for that one as well?
I think so.
Excellent. There goes track limits. Right, Samarth, you're up finally. What's your first choice?
My first choice is the FIA regulation. It's Article 9.1b to be precise.
Good research.
It says both cars entered must be presented in substantially the same livery at every competition. And you know what? It annoys me for numerous reasons, right? It annoys me for one, because I genuinely sometimes cannot tell the difference between the two cars. I know we have the little pylon on the top, which is yellow and then black, but then you got to remember which car's the second car now, because it's not as easy as saying, oh, well, Lewis Hamilton's the first car or the second car. It's not that easy, because they can choose that for aesthetic reasons now. So I have no idea which car is which. And standing in the TV pen, sometimes I'll be like, oh, how was your battle with Verstappen? And then someone will be like, oh, that was actually Perez, and I'll just feel like a total idiot, because they're just not different enough. So firstly, it would be nice to differentiate the two cars a little bit. And if we hark back to 1999, when I think it was BAR did it, And that's probably the one time someone tried a split livery, and they had 555 on Ricardo Zonta's car, and then Jacques Villeneuve was the Lucky Strike one. So 2 cigarette brands, 2 different cars, and then the FIA said no. And what was created is, in my opinion, one of the ugliest liveries of all time. A confused mess of 2 cigarette brands, loads of weird colours, and a zip in the middle. It's just horrifying mess. Now, had they allowed it, we would have had something cool. We would have had a team that has its own identity split across 2 different cars. So we would still know that it's a BAR. So I don't think there was a big issue there. And I think that teams now could do some wonders with special liveries where you could have Carlos Sainz with a little Spanish motif at home. You know, when the Thai Grand Prix comes around, you could have Alex Albon with loads of Thai stuff on the back of his Williams. I think that would look really cool.
I see you thought it through well. Thai stuff, well researched.
Okay, that felt dismissive. That was not to be dismissive. I was just trying to think of something Thai. Without being like
a green curry.
See, that's what I didn't want to say. I'm sorry to the people of Thailand for that. I'm sure this is terrible.
You're digging yourself a hole here.
I still think there'd be loads of room for drivers to have special liveries if we could split them across cars. It'd be really interesting. And it could also mean that we could do some more retro stuff. You know, we could have Fernando harking back to a Minardi or something like that. We could just have more identity for a single driver. I think it's a bit of an arbitrary rule, really. It reminds me of the time they were like, your helmet design can't change over a season or something. And people just did it anyway because they were like, well, I need to, give some value to my sponsors and do some crazy stuff with my designs. I always think it's nice when we see drivers kind of be a bit more flamboyant.
I must admit, at the time, I quite liked the helmet rule when it came in, but I was completely wrong. It was stupid. The problem with helmets now is that they're not that visible. So that's just the nature of the safetyness of the cars. So yeah, I was looking for something that wasn't achievable. What do you think, Ben, on this? Do you like the symmetry of the cars?
I do like the symmetry of the cars. My biggest concern is that Samarth can't see the numbers, which have been deliberately enlarged to prevent this very problem of misidentification.
It is still hard to see them, unfortunately.
Do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is because I'm going back to the prior era. You know, they obviously gave every driver their individual number to try and deal with this issue of identification. So it's like you'll always look out for the same number rather than it changing every season. But they were so small that, from trackside particularly, you just couldn't tell. So I think I've been spoiled in the sense that I started from a very low base and now it's much easier for me to see the massive 11 on the front of Sergio Perez's car versus the 1. I mean, I accept the Red Bulls are all using 1s, so that does make it a lot more difficult for you. But I think probably broadly that's less of an issue. I think it's one of those nice ideas in theory, let's have all the cars in sort of individual liveries, but then you'd lose the sense of team behind it, I suppose, because the idea is that the 2 cars are part of a collective push. I don't know how it would work in terms of the commercial arrangements too, because you've obviously got big...
I can see the appeal of split brands for a sponsor potentially. Some won't want that, but that's what
depends on the sponsor, doesn't it? I think that's why BAR did it, because it's like, well, we've got a cigarette brand backing the team, and they've got multiple products that they'd like to promote. So let's split it.
I was quite amenable to this argument because I do like the idea of teams having flexibility to have different liveries across the 2 cars. But there was just an image that leapt into my mind of RBs having a Visa car and a Cash App car, or Sauber having a State car and a Kit car. They'd just ruin it, wouldn't they? That's the danger. That's the one danger.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh God, this is a bad idea. Actually, this would suck, wouldn't it? Oh God, because the amount. I think you should of weird.
You should just get glasses, Samarth. I think if you get nice, powerful glasses like the evil version of Edd Straw is wearing right now for this podcast, you'll be able to identify those numbers that are miles distance. Your main problem will be gone, and then we don't need to worry about the rest of it. We can spare the fire this time.
I think the numbers are too small.
Yeah.
I think the numbers are still too small. I think we need NASCAR style massive numbers on the side. So I'm going to change my rule and say that. And there are regulations on how big the numbers should be. They should just make them massive, right?
Yeah,
it would look fantastic. job done. All right, forget the split liveries, because you're right. All these weird brands that I don't get will just ruin it. I don't want to name any, but yeah.
Sorry, we already did.
So yeah, well, we're going to have to take both cars in the same livery. That's staying, but you're trying to submit the numbers rule. But that's the fundamental tension, isn't it? The numbers are an inconvenience for those designing the livery. They don't want them there, hence they'll always minimise them. So yeah, it would help to do that. So I think this is the trapdoor not opening, isn't it? So we can see if we've got a nice trapdoor not opening sound effect. I wonder what that would sound like. Might sound like nothing. Sounds like an easy one. Let's see what we've got. Right. This is going to sound great once it's edited. Who knows? Anyway, that's our first round. We'll be back in a moment with more. We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first, let me tell you about Grammarly. Your time and expertise are valuable, and with professionals spending nearly half the work week on written communication, focus is one of the most important things to have at work. With Grammarly as your AI writing partner, you can stay focused and get through your work faster with relevant, real-time suggestions wherever you write. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features, like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. And best of all, Grammarly works across 500,000 apps and websites, allowing you to work smarter, not longer. For 15 years, Grammarly has helped professionals do more with their writing. So what are you waiting for? Get more done with Grammarly. Download Grammarly free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Playoff baseball is back. I'm Derek Van Riper, host of the Athletics Rates and Barrels podcast. Join Eno Saris,
Mr. Stats Guy,
Britt Chiroli,
how you like them apples,
Trevor May, and I as we dig deep into the key matchups and advanced stats driving the critical decisions throughout the postseason. From the first crack of the bat in the wild card round until the last pitch of the World Series, we have you covered. Check out the Rates and Barrels podcast every day during the postseason wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, we're on to round two now. I'll go first again, and the rule I want lifted is the in-season testing ban.
Ooh.
This came in 2009. Now, there have been a few exceptions in that there's been the odd in-season test occasionally, and there's also tyre testing. You can do testing of old cars. But
when is an in-season ban not an in-season ban?
Exactly. But generally, for the most part, normal team testing for teams' own reasons with the current car doesn't generally happen. I'd like that ban lifted. The reason is because there's a cost cap. Now, there's a few things you'd have to do to make sure that you ensure that the cost is even for teams, because Ferrari could say, oh, Fiorano's free, whereas other teams have to do it. So you probably have to create a notional cost for a test day. But I'd like teams to have the opportunity to do that should they want to. I don't think it would turn into open season because I don't think there's enough headroom in the cost cap to do that. But it will allow teams to, if they want to, go and do a test day, or if drivers are struggling, go and do a test day just to work on something. And I think, to me, now that the cost cap's in and established, there's a chance to lift some of these cost-saving things and say, well, you can do it if you want, but if you do a couple of test days, that's going to be some floors you can't make or whatever. So that's my proposal. In-season testing ban lifted, and I think the cost cap will ensure that it doesn't turn into 50 test days a year. I just don't think that's going to happen. Any objections?
I don't know. I quite like it now. I quite like the lack of testing and the kind of unpredictability that teams kind of get. I mean, I don't know if I fully like teams bringing upgrades to the track and then having to kind of redo them, because it's become quite a boring, tiresome story now of seeing a floor not working and then trying to predict which floor they're using for FP1 because the last one didn't work, and are they harking back to Miami spec. But No, I like the restrictions on running. It makes things a bit more unpredictable. I think it's helped us have this kind of convergence this year. Maybe that's also down to the kind of aerodynamic testing period thing as well, that punishes the first place constructor by giving them 70% and then gives the last place constructor 115% or something. I think that really helps with parity. I think in-season tests should be kept to a minimum. Leave it, man. That's their job. They can turn up on a Friday, drive, and that's all they get. I like it. Let's be harsh on them.
Yeah, I would have said the same. My biggest concern about the pitch was the cost implication, but Ed saw that off at the pass by saying,
preemptive.
Well, you were preemptive indeed. So, the cost gap should, in theory, providing you dot the I's and cross the T's, take care of that. I suppose also it maybe benefits a wider spread of the grid, because all that's happened since in-season testing was banned is that people have invested more in simulation and simulators so that they can do testing all the time, just in the virtual world. So you end up in a situation of haves and have-nots, where the best, most well-funded teams have the best simulation tools and simulators, and some of the smaller teams have, well, in some cases, no simulator, and certainly, less sharp tools for simulation. Whereas if you are able to go onto a track in the real world, there's no substitute for that. The data you can get from that is always going to be better than anything you can make in the virtual world. I think the trickiness of the current formula, the ground effect cars and the peakiness, has exposed actually the virtual simulation tools. They were all geared around this kind of previous era of, as you've described it many times, Ed, infinite downforce that you can just keep adding in almost linear way and getting performance. And you can't do that anymore. And all these simulation tools they just haven't worked in the same way. And I think a lot of teams would have been able to get their heads around some of the problems better if they'd been able to just go off and do a test. And you've seen even top teams, Red Bull most recently and most high profile, getting Verstappen in an old car to get round the testing ban so that he can get some kind of feel for something different compared to what they're doing now. So it is a problem. I don't know if solving that problem would make F1 better, though, because I kind of feel like this difficulty that everyone's having with the cars and the fact that they can't test properly to solve them is a good thing, because they're having to do so much more of their learning on Grand Prix weekends, getting things wrong, having to backpedal. It's been so stayed for so long. You just knew, okay, these are the roughly best teams, biggest teams with the most money and the best development cycles. They're just going to keep bringing more new parts, adding them and pulling further away. Now it's not like that. Even the best teams with the best track records are messing their cars up unexpectedly. I think that's really good for Formula One. And I think probably the testing ban being in place aids that rather than hinders it.
Well, this looks like a clear defeat. I'm defeated 2-1 on this, but that's okay because I got the fastest lap one through. Anything else, it is a bonus. So the brief was to make F1 better. So perhaps that is a reasonable argument to make in counter to my suggestion. Right, Ben, you're next up with your second proposal.
Oh yeah, my second pick: the super license qualification points.
So let anyone into F1.
Well, the thing is. No, but since they were brought in, who would have got into F1 that didn't deserve to be in F1 that this system has kept out? And before it came in, off the back of Max Verstappen, getting into F1 before he was 18 and before he could drive a car on the road, who got into F1 who shouldn't have got into F1 that the super license system could have kept out? I can't think of anyone really. There's a couple of, there's 2 or 3 borderline examples. So if the super license system was in place before it came into force, like pre-hybrid era, Max Chilton wouldn't have qualified for F1. Rio Haryanto wouldn't have qualified for F1. I think he was 4th in GP2, so he would have just missed out. They were credible drivers, but they would have just not been able to bludgeon their way in. And Marcus Ericsson, that's probably the most difficult example in the sense that he didn't qualify under the super license system, but had he not got into F1 with his Swedish sponsors, it's likely that the Sauber, soon-to-be Audi team, wouldn't exist anymore. So you could argue actually not having the super license system has made F1 better because it's protected one of the teams. Other than that, I think it makes absolutely no difference. The level of drivers has been too strong anyway for the super license point system to make a difference. All it has done has excluded certain drivers who might have been worth a shot, like Colton Herta when Red Bull were interested in him. And there's also been cases where some guys have had to have like a dispensation to get in anyway. I think Pietro Fittipaldi, who started 2 races for Haas, he didn't quite have enough points, or rather his bulk of qualifying points were before the cutoff, so he had to apply to get them transferred to the season after he attained them in order that he would then qualify for the super license. So there's been workarounds anyway. It hasn't stopped, the guys testing or practicing in an F1 car slightly different. I remember Alfonso Celis doing practice runs for Force India and being quite rubbish, and you thought, it'd be good if there's a system to keep guys like that out who are not good enough. But Roy Nassani did testing for Williams, so that kind of I can buy a test or buy a practice session thing has always been kind of in play even until quite recently. So I just don't really see, other than forcing everybody into the FIA single-seater pyramid and killing off external championships, I don't see what the super license point system has achieved or does achieve now.
What do you think, Samarth?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, well made. And it also prevents one of the world's best driver, Kyle Larson, who is better than Max Verstappen, from competing, because he only has like 29 super license points, and then a bunch will expire, I think 50. Actually, I'm going to look it up. NASCAR gets you get 15 for winning the NASCAR Cup Championship, which in my opinion is quite a difficult one to win.
Yeah.
And they'll wear off this season. So
no, not a marginal opinion.
Well, that's the same amount as DTM. So how do they formulate these? So, for example, Formula E gives you 30 super license points for winning, but so does Formula 3 Championship. Are they saying that those are the same value to them? I mean,
same value to the FIA.
I agree with you, Ben. It seems to be funneling people into
This is what the problem is, in that the basic idea of a super license qualification points is okay, and there should be a good standard for it, but it's become politicised. It's become a measure of a championship's worth. It's just got completely out of hand, and it comes down to that desire to standardise things fully correctly. And I do wonder if they're better off having. You can have a slightly more broad qualification for it. For example, there used to be a point where the super license would depend on having wins at certain levels. So let's use the Colton Herta example. If you'd said, if you've won 4 IndyCar races, you qualify for a super license, that would have got him in no problem.
Yeah.
And you could win 1 IndyCar race being not very good and supremely lucky. Maybe you could get 2 if lightning struck twice, pretty unlikely, but you're not going to get 3 or 4 without being seriously good. So yeah, it feels like it's become very corrupted, and it's become a measure of what F1 values, and I don't think that's correct,
and too narrow a measure as well, because
yes.
You are forced to pick from a much narrower pool of guys who've done F4, F3, F2, maybe Formula Regional, Formula Renault as it used to be called, and these other slightly more out there championships. Whether you rate the grid in NASCAR or IndyCar or wherever, highly or not, you should have the opportunity to test your individual theory about a specific driver by bringing them in and seeing if they can handle it. There'd have been no problem, no argument from anyone on the grid or anyone in the paddock about her to having a shot. And whether he makes the grade or not, well, you don't know. But you now don't have the opportunity, because we just have to look at this one Eurocentric narrow pyramid of single-seater racing, basically, or someone has to bludgeon their way through winning, multiple different categories all over the place, like Franco Colapinto. He barely qualifies, but he does on the basis of doing some ELMS and Asian Le Mans and some GT racing, plus his single-seater stuff. So I just think it's kind of an answer to a question no one was really asking. And if they were asking it, they were asking it for the wrong reasons and not really being well informed about how everything generally works and how Formula One naturally kind of filters out the chaff that doesn't really make the grade well before it has a chance to cause any embarrassment, certainly these days.
Well, for full disclosure, I mean, when the idea was first floated, I thought it was a decent one, but it's just gone completely out there. It's missing the point. It's a lot like so many things that happen in Formula One. You take a reasonable idea, then it gets hammered into an absurd shaped hole and makes just no sense. So yeah, you've got to have a bar. But when you look back, Max Verstappen wouldn't have been eligible for a super license, I think, under the current rules. Kimi Räikkönen wouldn't have been. I don't think Fernando Alonso would have quite made it. He was an F3000 race winner. He'd won the Open Fortuna Nissan Series. Jenson Button, I don't think, would have made it because he finished third in British F3 and he'd done Formula Ford, but nothing else. So yeah, when you look back at those case studies, you're thinking, this isn't quite right, is it? So yeah, I'd like to see something more. If they're going to have the qualification points, it needs to be revamped. Yeah. And I do wonder whether you just need a qualification board. You set some basic criteria. You've got to have won. For example, you've got to have won an F2 feature race or something, things like that.
It's a common sense approach, right? Rather than this just arbitrary thing, where it's like, you're top 3 in this series, regardless of the level of that series in that given year, you're guaranteed to be in. But this guy who didn't do that series or couldn't afford to or whatever, but is objectively better and has won at all other levels, no, you can't come in. Like, that's just...
Yeah.
Maybe it was an intended consequences. Maybe it was an unintended consequence. But the current system is just pointless. It doesn't achieve anything. So I would bin it.
And you just know that there's lobbying gone on from championships. It's a measure of worth, and people can advertise championships for it. So that it's just become massively corrupted. So yeah, super license qualification points, certainly in the form it's in, through the trapdoor. Right, Samarth, a second proposal now. Make sure it's one that you don't lose faith in halfway through.
I'm not going to lose faith in this one, I promise. It's the one that Lando Norris called possibly the worst rule ever invented in F1. Now, I don't really agree with that because
it's not worse than elimination qualifying.
No, it's not.
I think we can all agree
definitely
that now. Elimination qualifying, stupidest idea ever.
Yeah, exactly, and double points and all that. But pitting during a red flag counts as a mandatory pit stop, and it gives teams a massive advantage. So that was when it happened in the 2021 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, when Lando Norris pitted during the safety car, and then just after that there was a red flag, which gave everyone else a chance to pit for free. It happened again in the 2020 Australian Grand Prix, and it happened in this year's Monaco Grand Prix when Perez, Magnussen, and I think it was Hulkenberg had a shunt at the start, and then everyone came in on lap 1, and what you had was a 77 lap stint on the same tyres, and it was a bit of a procession. So it kind of eliminates the kind of strategy bit, which at Monaco is a really important thing because you just can't overtake. And it also gives people a massive advantage if they can pit during the red flag and skip the safety car pit instead. Because obviously there's no time penalty, they can do it in the pits. Now, I do think people should be able to repair their cars during a red flag, of course. I think that if you've had a massive shunt, I'd rather not lose cars from the race and have them repaired during the red flag. But it completely eliminates any kind of strategic ploys, any kind of fun from the race, any kind of offsets later on in the race, because everyone's just on the same strategy now. So I'd really like to bin that. I will say, though, that I don't know what the alternative could be. I mean, would you put a mandatory pit stop after that? Would you say...
Well, it comes down, just to get technical, the rule is you have to use 2 tyre compounds. The rule doesn't actually state you have to make a pit stop. Obviously you do, because that's how you change tyres. But that could be the mechanism for it. You could say you have to make a live pit stop or something to force that. So that's the kind of the mechanism. It's a small point, but worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, no, that's actually, that is a good point. Yeah, it's not a mandatory pit stop. It's switching for the primes or the options or whatever. So, yeah, I guess the rule would be to say it doesn't count. You still have to go and switch tyres, and you have to do it in a live environment, which would be much better, much more fun. I mean, Fernando Alonso was really incensed after this year's Monaco Grand Prix. He said the only point of interest in a Monaco race is the pit stops that you have to do. If you remove that excitement of a pit stop, then it becomes nothing, which is quite scathing in a typical Fernando Alonso way. But I do agree with him, yeah. Ben, have you got anything to dispute about that?
No, this time I think you're onto something. I agree with the idea of having red flag restarts. So this whole idea of, right, let's do a proper form up on the grid again, rather than just, sit in the pits for ages, go back out in single file and race on. Great, yeah, that's fine for the show. But I don't understand why the red flag period is treated like a reset, where you can change the car, fix bits, change tyres, all that kind of stuff. My understanding in racing was always that the red flag period was part of the race, unless the race was ending. So, and even so, if it was ending, you'd be into park for May. So park for May conditions should always apply through a red flag period, and you should only be able to do something to the car that is critical to it running and restarting, or because there's a dangerous thing. If there's something hanging off that needs to be put back so that you can actually carry on, fine. If you've got a puncture or a destroyed bit of car needs to be changed and you can take the restart, fine. But this idea that you can just do whatever you like to the car and make it better for when the next stint of the race effectively starts, I'm not down with that at all. I think the only exception should be if the weather has dramatically changed and race control says, right, we've gone from a dry race to a wet race, therefore everybody should be allowed to change tyres, because you can't make everybody restart the race on slicks if it's teeming down with rain. But other than that, I think the car should be not touched. They should restart on the tyres they've got, and I absolutely agree that tyre changes during red flag periods, as outlined by Norris and you, Samarth, they should get in the bin.
Yeah, I do dislike this happening. The devil is in the detail, though, because obviously the reason why the tyre changes are allowed is for safety reasons, because of the risk of punctures, etc. Because there's been a crash. I mean, let's say there was a red flag in Baku when Perez and Sainz had their collision. There was debris all over the track.
How is a new tyre more likely to... Oh, I see what you mean, because the tyre might already have debris in it.
It might, yeah. So it's considered as a safety thing. So that's one thing. Now, that one's quite easy to get around, because you could just say, right, can we just appeal to the FIA to change the tyre because it's lost pressure or whatever? It's quite easy to prove, quite easy to do quite quickly.
Yeah, surely every Pirelli engineer can just check that. Exactly. The team that they're assigned to.
That's one way of doing it. I mean, it is a little bit awkward in that if you have a restart after you've been running for ages on hard tyres, it might be almost impossible to wake those tyres up. But that's the limitations of the tyres. And obviously, you've got the slight problem of if you do need to replace a tyre because there's a puncture, you've got the problem of not being able to mix and match sets. You might not have, you might have one set of hards into the race and you've got a puncture on one. Then where do you get that extra tyre from? So there's a few little complications there with the tyre allocation. But because red flags are quite frequent now, we haven't had one for a while, but obviously if you look at historic frequency of red flags, it's just got off the chart in recent years. So this isn't something that happens.
They threw one for gravel, didn't they? When Albon went off in Melbourne. They essentially did a NASCAR type thing. When gravel on the track, red flag. I thought that was insane.
There was one in practice in Singapore for a lizard.
I'm sure the lizard was grateful.
It was very grateful. The lizard was having a lovely time charging around, running away from the marshals. Great. But yes, there's a few little details to be solved there. But I think because if this happened, if there's a red flag once every 2 years, and then in half of those occasions you got some weird result because of it, it would kind of be okay, but it happens with more frequency now. So I think, that does need to be looked at. Just need to solve some of those little problems around the edges to make sure that it actually works, although plenty of that could be solved by the tyres being a little bit different in terms of their concept. But yeah, that one makes it through. Well done, Samarth. You've got your first one through.
Yay.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
College football is back like never before. I'm David Ubben, and I host Until Saturday, the Athletics Leveled Up College Football Podcast. 3 times a week, you'll hear me and my co-hosts, fellow Athletics senior writer Chris Vanini and 2-time national champion Damian Harris, embrace the sport's new madness with you. We're also just going to have a ton of fun enjoying all the things that make college football great. Check out the brand new Until Saturday, every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday this fall. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Right, on to the third round now. So my third pick, which won't come as a surprise to anyone listening, is the current form of sprint races.
No, you love them, don't you, Ed?
Well,
I'm shocked.
the sprint races are okay. The races are normally fine. They're short and sharp and fine. However, I would do away with them and then replace it with one of two things. The sort of dull option is nothing, just do the normal Grand Prix weekend. But what I'd be much more interested in seeing is F1 really running with the promise of a sprint race and the opportunity, not just making it like a Grand Prix stint, but something genuinely different. And there's ways of doing that, reverse grids, etc. Because as it is, it's just a mini race. It damages what we see on Sunday because teams gain a lot of tyre data and that kind of thing. Way easier for them to manage the race. So it diminishes the Grand Prix in two ways because it's a preview of that for those watching, and it makes the Grand Prix less likely to be volatile. And it just feels like a missed opportunity. And again, all of this talk about, the sprint race will be great. And then they try to do everything to make the sprint race as flat as it possibly can. Now, there have been some good ones. I've never found them boring because they're a race and there's always stuff going on, even the processional ones. But it just feels like a missed opportunity. And I think if you're going to do something, do it. Do it properly. Go with it. Not just sort of, we're going to introduce this, but we're going to be terrified and make it as similar as we possibly can to the rest of it. And that's what I find weird about it. So, yeah, that's my pitch. Anyone wants to defend sprint races?
Yeah, I think so. Because I was of a similar mind for a long time and then covered a sprint weekend. I think it was Miami this year. To the whole weekend for the race, and with this mindset of sprints, what's the point? I'm with Max Verstappen and Edd Straw. Let's be traditionalists and just have 3 practice sessions in a race. What's the point? And then I was thinking, well, actually, even though it happens in a topsy-turvy way, you've got the same race weekend, but it's more representative because you've got sprint qualifying, which is effectively the qualifying simulations they do in practice. But they have to do them on proper fuel loads and proper engine modes. You haven't got this kind of all guesswork thing going on. And then the sprint race is effectively the Friday practice race runs, but it's an actual race run where they have to put the tyres on and do it properly. So the data you get and the knowledge you get as an observer or a fan is better than what you get from watching these kind of piecemeal practice sessions where they're all doing their own thing. So the end result is the same. It's just what it's called and when it happens is slightly different. The one thing I think they should do, if they're going to, as you put it, Ed, go with it properly on sprint races, is make them count for more. The points system for a sprint race it makes them pretty much worthless. No one's thinking about like the difference the sprint makes to the championship because the gaps between the different positions is so small. And the amount that you earn compared to the normal point system is so much less. So I think if you wanted to make them feel like they were more significant and also for the teams and drivers to take them more seriously in terms of how much they're prepared to risk, you need to award more points for them and make them more an intrinsic part of the championship. I know that's a controversial opinion because they want to protect the sacrosanct Grand Prix on a Sunday and that count for more. That's fine. But I think the sprint race as it is, the points system in particular it's not worth it. So therefore you don't ever as a competitor prioritize the sprint race really because it's not worth it.
Samarth, you're looking like you're about to say something profound.
I mean, they're okay, aren't they? It just feels like it's a half-baked idea, doesn't it? I mean, it just feels like what you said, Ed.
No, in F1, surely not.
Yeah, who would have thunk it? But yeah, it just feels like, and I agree with you, Ben. I mean, it's just, what difference does it really make? I mean, a one make would be nice. Bring back the M1 Pro cars. That'd be great. And I do think that spectators need a bit more value out of the weekend. But then part of that just comes down to reducing the prices.
Certainly.
You don't need to keep adding more in.
Yeah, having 2-day race meetings.
Yeah,
you could do that. That's kind of what sprints have taught us, isn't it? That you don't need 3 days of running. I know the promoters won't like that, but you don't need Grand Prix to be 3 days.
The thing is, though, that obviously that the argument that's often made, which you sort of inch towards, is that a sprint is better than FP3, which certainly is. There's no argument about that. But for me, it's that it could be so much more better, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
In that you can offer something just more interesting, more different, more distinct, with a real identity. It just that's the thing that frustrates me with it, because I would say I'd rather keep the sprint but do that than just go back to what we have on a normal weekend. So,
but you're pitching for the
sprint,
binning of the sprint, though, aren't you? That's what you said at the start.
Well, bin the current form of sprint races, and then it's either, if you can't be bothered to do it properly, just go back to the normal weekend. Or if you can really be bothered to be, Liberty Media meant to be, oh yeah, they're great sports marketing people, etc., etc., etc. Well, they're not with the sprints, are they? I remember one of the early sprints, and they were pushing the TV companies to really promote how exciting the sprints were. And the messaging was completely mad. I remember even Ross Brawn talking about it. And he was talking about how great the sprint was, and then listed all the things that they brought in for the main Grand Prix to liven it up and make it more interesting that weren't in there, pushed as a positive. And I remember watching one of the Sky build-ups to the race, all the strategic possibilities. And it's like, what, start on softs or start on mediums? That's two strategic possibilities.
Ooh.
It's you're not working with much, but I just feel there's opportunities there to do more. But it's just fear, isn't it? It's fear because they don't want to damage cars, or they don't want to do something more extreme, or they want something that's different but so discernibly similar that you can't tell the difference. That's what I find weird and frustrating. So do something with it.
Yeah. Well, I think also they've actually gone back a step, even with what they have, because the original sprint counted for the grid, didn't it?
Yeah.
So it had a much more tangible impact on the shape of the championship and the Grand Prix weekend itself than what we have now, which is a ring-fenced thing. So they almost admitted defeat of their own concept by backtracking on it, that step, and going, right, let's just have, sprint qualifying and sprint day, or whatever it's called now. So if I'm voting to bin it entirely, I think no, because I still think that there's enough there that makes it better than the standard weekend. But if I'm voting to bin the current iteration of it and replace or modify elements of it to make it better, then yeah, I would agree with you. I'd vote for that.
Excellent. So, Martha, are you going with the current form of sprint races being binned?
Yeah, I wouldn't bin actual sprints. I wouldn't bin sprints, but I'd bin, just how we have them, half-baked kind of. And by the way, Ed, I do disagree. It is kind of bloody boring, especially at the back. I mean, you'll have like Lance Stroll driving around for nothing. I feel bad for the guy. What are they doing? I will also just tack on, there's too much rubbish around the weekend. I mean, to have massive gaps between sessions doesn't make any sense. And it's just so long, those weekends. So they could just...
I think Williams would have appreciated those massive gaps at many points this season.
It's quite a useful gap for some people. That's fair.
Excellent. Well, I think the sprint races have made it in their current form. Let's make them better. So that makes it in. Right, Ben, your final submission.
Yeah, my final submission. I mean, I guess this counts as rules because it's coming. It's sort of in play now in an unofficial way. It's these overtaking guidelines / rules, which are due to be certified in the International Sporting Code, but which are being kind of trialled this year, I think is the right way of putting it, this year in Formula One. I have no time for this. Like, again, it's done with this, a bit like track limits, it's done with this aim of achieving consistency to the detriment of all else in decision making. So it's a thing for the stewards and the FIA and for nobody else. And the idea that you can completely codify to the most microscopic detail and nth degree the art form of racing on track, overtaking, battling with somebody, I have no time for that. You can't do it. It won't work. It's already not really working. So before this even makes it into a position where it's enshrined in the rule book, they should bin it.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. And I think as I've always said, the overtaking rules just oversimplify something very complex.
Yeah, use your common sense, basically. It's like, when you don't have these kind of, permanent stewards that go to every race, and obviously the drivers and the teams are partly to blame for this push as well, because they are always pushing for consistency, especially when they're the ones on the wrong end of a decision. But I think you just have to take the rough with the smooth in racing. It's a completely dynamic process. It's completely contextual based on where you are, what's happening in a given moment, who you're racing against, what the status of your particular car is at that moment. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to judging overtaking moves, who's done it right, who's done it wrong. You just have to take it on a case-by-case basis and use your best judgment and your common sense and the experience of the people you've got in the stewards room to make a call. Sometimes that call will be wrong, sometimes it will be marginal, often it will be right. We can argue about it, people can get upset about it. That's just part of sport. And it goes back again to this kind of VAR in football unintended consequence thing. You're doing it with a reasonable intention, but actually the end result is not worth the unintended consequences you create from doing that thing.
Yeah, very much so. And ultimately the stewards too often end up bound by them, because they, rather than applying their experience and knowledge, they have to...
They can't.
Hold those, and they end up doing decisions that they don't want to do. That's
this idea that you can basically, because it's all judged on where your front axle is in relation to the other car at a precise moment, you can just barrel or come off the brakes to a ridiculous degree or do something almost erratic to get to that finite point, regardless of the circumstance, and then you win the corner, regardless of whether you are being overtaken or the one overtaking. That is just silly. And it will only get worse if they make that a proper thing. Everyone's going to start driving to that rather than just using their common sense. And you won't get these really fun occasional battles where a guy's overtaking somebody, then they're coming back at them and all of this kind of stuff. The thing where you can, cut somebody off at the exit of a corner, that's part of the art of racing. The guy being overtaken has to know when to give up the corner and go, yeah, I've been defeated. They can't just hang on there and then the other guy gets penalised because they just wouldn't get out of the way. No, that's part of the art of racing, and sometimes you have to learn those arts the hard way by getting forced off the track or getting beaten up a bit. They need to stop trying to just regulate everything to the nth degree and kind of ruining in the process some of these nebulous artistic elements of racing that are really, really hard to define.
I think the overtaking rules as they are is through. No objections. Yeah, carried 3-0. So that one is through the trapdoor.
That's a hat trick for me. That's a hat trick for me, I think.
You win. Well done.
Thank you.
Let's see if Samarth can get a consolation goal. What's your final pick?
Wait, I thought my last one was my first goal. Am I not 1-0 up?
Well, a second consolation goal. Ben's already got 3, so we're both beaten.
Oh, right. Okay, a second.
I don't think I've done consolation goal properly there, really, because probably a consolation goal is a 1 goal, isn't it? So, yeah, I think you've got me there.
Yeah, because if you lose 3-2, yeah, that's not bad. That's actually not a bad result.
But it's still a loss.
That's the important thing. You are defeated.
Thanks, Ben.
You're defeated and you've offended a whole nation. Other than that, it's gone well.
Now, my one is if you accrue 12 penalty points on your license over a 12-month period, you will be suspended for the following competition.
Oh, hello, Kevin Magnussen.
Yeah, poor Kevin Magnussen, right? I mean, he got that this year, and the drivers almost all sympathise with him. And I think it's okay to have a rule that you kind of notch up penalties, but we shouldn't do them for things like some of the things that Kevin Magnussen got penalised for were just so harsh. And my issue is that he's already been punished in a lot of cases during the race. So what you're doing is punishing during the race, giving him a massive penalty that basically takes him out of the running for anything meaningful, although he did manage to scrape points a couple of times. I think it was Jeddah, notably, where he scraped points. And I was like, well, maybe the on-track punishment just wasn't quite enough there. But then to notch it up on his super license.
Monza too, the race he was banned, I think he managed to come home 10th, didn't he, even with the time penalty?
He drove really well in that race. He was 9th on the road, yeah.
Yeah, but giving them 2 penalties seems just a bit ridiculous there because, it's like a double jeopardy situation, really, where you have the race penalty and the spectre of another one coming up. And I think that should be limited to really severe things. For example, where Romain Grosjean, I think it was I want to say Catalonia, where he spun off. I think it was around turn 2 or 3, and then did this the most insane rejoining maneuver I've ever seen, where he created a massive smoke screen and he took out 10 cars. That kind of thing, really dangerous. That deserves a yellow card or a red card and being like, right, maybe we'll consider a massive grid penalty or even a suspension for the next race. But half the things Kevin Magnussen did not deserve such a heavy-handed approach. But, you know, George Russell was one of the people who didn't really sympathise with him. He said that you could argue were the penalty points actually harsh enough. You could argue that some of the incidents perhaps were not harsh enough. So he said that basically Magnussen could have been penalised even more for some of those things. But then I looked back and what I saw, there's no consistency there. To use one of your favourite buzzwords, Ben.
Yeah, I don't want consistency.
No, you hate
don't
consistency.
Care about consistency.
No. Yeah, so they 3 points for track limits and then 2 points for punting someone off a race. Does it make any sense? Not really. And punishing someone 12 months after their first offence seems a bit arbitrary. But yeah, I'd like to know if you guys think it's ridiculous as well.
I mean, we did a video on this, didn't we, Ed, where we talked at length about the system, and this double jeopardy element was raised.
Yeah.
And I have some sympathy for that position. I kind of agree with the idea of having some kind of system. You know, it's no different to football, where you have a totting up procedure and a certain point at which you reset. You know, in this case, in season. In Formula One's case, obviously, it's every 12 months. You could argue that maybe that time frame is too narrow, or the amount of points, the threshold at which you trigger a ban is too low for the level of offence that the points are being awarded for, or how many points are being awarded for those offences. I agree that some of Magnussen's offences have been trivial, and there have been other things that have happened, including with him, where you could argue that he should have had a bigger penalty in that moment. So I don't have a problem with somebody being banned if they've totted up enough. I question whether the system as it is right, as you've outlined. But I still ultimately feel like, you know, it should be more common sense thing. Again, rather than having this kind of, black and white system that you just default to, you should make a judgment call based on the incident itself. If someone's doing something, has done one thing that's incredibly dangerous, ban them. You know, that's what used to happen. You know, if someone did something really erratic that caused a huge shunt and endangered lives, ban them. If someone's doing lots of things that are quite close to that, ban them. But you don't need to have this system whereby, you've had a few racing incidents and all of them have got points and therefore you're automatically banned. I don't think it really achieves anything either. You know, so Kevin Magnussen sat out a race and we've all talked about it. He's come back. He's got a clean slate. Is he a different driver? Has he spent the Azerbaijan Grand Prix reflecting on his behaviour as a driver and thinking, I need to change. You know, I'm not cut out for this. No, it achieves nothing other than it. I mean, unintended consequences. It gives another driver a shot, but it's not a driver that hadn't already had a shot and wasn't already going to be on the grid next year anyway. So again, hasn't really achieved anything. I don't think the system as is really does anything other than potentially lead to bans that shouldn't really be bans.
It comes down to a little bit similar to the super license qualification points, only even more extreme. It's a sound, broad principle, but applied terribly. Because for me, I mean, again, I advocated for having something a little bit more like this, but the drive for consistency means there's this tariff. So if you do causing a collision, you get 2 points, all this kind of thing. Again, just trying to standardise it and have consistency. But what I wanted to see happen, because I actually think you want fewer penalties. Honest mistakes should have to happen. But let's say one race, I completely misjudge an overtaking manoeuvre, I lock up and I pile into the side of you at turn one. Honest mistake, no punishment. Well, you can get maybe a few points just to say that's not the sort of thing that should happen. Because then if you do it several times, that's more of a pattern of behaviour where you're just being reckless and not doing it. And that, to me, is very different to what we've got here, where you get it for very, very minor little things. So I want it to exist in a form whereby you can, if there's sort of people who are repeat offenders, you never quite do anything extreme enough on its own to warrant a ban, but accumulate a lot of stuff. Then I'd like to see that. I mean, I must admit, in terms of Magnussen, I didn't have a vast amount of sympathy for him in that he knew he was on those points. Some of those points he accrued deliberately helping his teammate in a perfectly legitimate by the rules way, but, you live by the sword, die by the sword, as it were. So I didn't mind that too much, but I just don't think the system is right as is. And probably under my system, obviously, he wouldn't have been banned. But that's just what I want to see. Something a little bit more meaningful that exists, not as a kind of pedantic, rather fussy system as it is now, but one that if there's someone who's just being reckless and stupid and, or just needs to learn, they need to just dial things back a little bit.
Yeah.
Then that works, and then that fits into making honest mistakes and not constantly punish them. As people listen to this podcast know, we all tend towards having fewer penalties if we can, but I'd rather see systems like this to in the bigger picture control that.
Yeah, higher threshold and more common sense approach taken in the round rather than, I think pedantic was a good way of putting it. That's what a lot of this general approach actually to the regulation of what happens on track in F1 over the last few years. It feels to me very pedantic and not really in the best interest of anyone, competitors or spectators. And
I think it also underestimates the fact that it's very dynamic and messy, the real world of racing. There's lots of moving things. You alluded to VAR in football. One of the reasons offsides are so problematic is the whole offside rule in football was created for an imperfect, imprecise world where you can't view it perfectly. Then you have video replays and you're trying to do it to the millimetre and you're trying to enforce a rule that was conceived specifically because of the limitations of how it was being policed. So it's just completely all over the shop. And I think some of the things in F1 ending up in the same sort of thing. You don't want to have open season and nothing. You've got to make sure things are safe and fair, etc. But yeah, I feel quite sorry often for stewards because they have a very specific job. They have to look at the guidelines as they are. They have to look at the rules as are.
Well, their job's being removed from them, isn't it? It's like it's regulation by AI. That's where we're headed. So actually, the stewards are just there to literally check the box. Oh, this conforms to this standard or doesn't, and away we go. Rather than actually being encouraged to use their sensible judgment. And
I know there have been cases in recent years where the stewards have issued a penalty they didn't want to issue because the rules, much like sentencing guidelines in a court of law, you might want to throw the book at someone, give them 10 years. But if the sentencing guidelines say it can't go beyond 2 years, that's your limit. These are how these things work. So yeah, it's interesting that quite a few of the things we've discussed here have been in that kind of area. So let's just review. Well, we've submitted 9 things to be ditched and 7 have got through, I think. The fastest lap point and track limits. Yeah, we've been them. Both cars, same livery. Samarth lost confidence in part of the way through. My in-season testing ban being lifted, that didn't make it through. Ben's super license qualification points and Samarth's red flag tyre changes, yep, they got the tick. And then, the current form of sprint races, I got that through. Ben, you got overtaking rules through, and Samarth, you got the 12 points and you're banned through. Some of these are ideas that can continue, but in very different forms, so effectively need to be ditched and started again. But let us know on social media or via comments on the race website, or if you're a member of the Race Members Club on Patreon, whether you agree with some of these things or disagree, or if you have some completely different ideas. You never know, might be some other suggestions that we can revisit in a future episode. But it's been a fun debate, so thanks very much to Ben and Samarth. Hopefully some ideas that can tweak the future of Formula One here if the right people are listening. Still a long way to go until the next race, but we're still going, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.